Now the function that we're talking about, and I won't read it to you, we've been talking about that in the last couple of videos. Okay, if x is close to negative 0.75, which is negative 3/4, then what's y going to be close to? Well, if x equals negative 0.75, or negative 3/4, that's the value that makes this factor of the numerator 0. So this is a 0 of the numerator. So if we're close to negative 0.75, this is going to be close to 0, so that y is going to be close to 0. Now there's still more that we want to know, though. And what we would like to know is, if we go a little bit on one side of negative 3/4, say x a little bit less than 3/4, is y going to be positive or negative? And if we go a little bit to the right, a little bit greater than negative 3/4, is y going to be positive or negative? So the answer to that question is going to depend, partially at least, not only on how negative 8x minus 6 changes when we go from a little less to a little greater than negative 3/4, but what the sign of each of these is if x is close to negative 3/4. So let's first, well, here's our function again, and if x is equal to negative 3/4, I want to know, is this positive or negative, is this positive or negative, and is this positive or negative? Now we save the question of what happens to 8x minus 6, because what's going to happen is, if 8x minus 6 is 0 at x equals negative 3/4, then on one side of negative 3/4, this is going to be positive, on the other side it's going to be negative. So this is going to change sign when x goes from one side to the other of negative 3/4. The others are not going to change sign unless x differs from negative 3/4 by quite a bit. So let's just focus on the question. If x is negative 3/4 or negative 0.75, is this factor greater or less than 0? Is this factor greater or less than 0? Is this factor greater or less than 0? You should pause and make that decision. Okay, well, hopefully you've done that. And hopefully you could do that without using a calculator. A couple of these are real easy to figure out without a calculator. For example, x plus 6. If x is negative 3/4, well, that's 6 is much bigger than 3/4, so this is clearly going to be positive. What about negative 6x minus 3? Well, if x is negative 3/4, is a little, we got to do a little calculation. 3/4 of 6 is 4.5, so that's going to be plus 4.5 minus 3. Oh, that's going to be greater than 0. What about 8x plus 8? Well, 3/4 of 8 is fairly easy to calculate. You might have to write it down on paper, but hopefully you can do that in your head. Either way, 3/4 of 8 is 6. Negative 3/4 of 8 is negative 6. So you got negative 6 plus 8, that's equal to 2. That's greater than 0. And let's see. Yep. Okay, so it turns out that all these factors are greater than 0. Now, let's find if x is slightly less than negative 0.75, well, that's not going to change the signs of these three terms. All these three terms are still going to be positive as long as x is pretty close to negative 0.75 or negative 3/4. But the 8x minus 6, if x is a little less than negative 3/4, well, 8x minus 6 is equal to 0 if x is equal to negative 0.75. That's where the negative 0.75 or negative 3/4 came from, by setting this equal to 0. If x is a little less than that, then 8x is going to be a little less than it was, and the minus 6 is going to be bigger than the positive 8x, which is going to make this less than 0. Okay? This thing has a positive slope, if you wish. Well, let's not worry about that. Have to write that out to make sense of it for you. Okay. In any case, you can verify if x is a little less than negative 0.75, this is going to be less than 0, which means this first term is going to be negative. All the other terms are going to be positive. So negative times a positive divided by a positive divided by a positive, all that's positive. We end up with y is negative. And if x is slightly greater than negative 0.75, then y is going to be, I haven't written out all the details, but everything's going to be positive. So the value of y is going to be positive. Now, I didn't write out the detail that 8x minus 6 will be greater than 0 as long as x is greater than negative 0.75. You should fill that in. You should verify that for yourself. But now we have more information about the graph of this function, at least in the vicinity of x equals negative 0.75.